So when I think about stories, Darryl, there's always the start point, once upon a time aspect. And you know, what comes to mind, I go back to the mid-1980s, and you probably know the year you're an 8th grade basketball player. We're having our first practice, and you know, John Carnes is the 8th grade coach in French Lick, and I'm the 7th grade coach my first year. And you trip at mid-court, and you end up with a broken arm, and
hold up.
yeah, that's my first introduction, you know, to Darryl Land in that piece. And I forget we're running down and backs or something of that nature, the two groups, and in that little small cafetorium gym. So it wasn't a whole lot of room with about 30 players at that point in time. But here you are, 35, almost 40 years later, redemption story, the Redemption Church, and how it got started. Where did all this come from in regards to Darryl and the family?
Yeah, and it's really crazy and interesting and all those things all in one when I think back to the very beginning of where we're at, because I think, you know, it seems sometimes, you know, a long time ago on a galaxy far, far away, it feels like it in so many ways, and yet sometimes it seems like yesterday. And so really the heartbeat of what happened here, I mean, I was raised in a Christian church, a Restoration Movement church, Red Quarry Christian Church in French Lick, Indiana, out in the country. And it was a strong church when I was growing up for the area, for a country church, you know, 150, 180 people coming to this little bitty country church. And that to me was big. You know, can't even fathom that I would have thought about a church of thousands in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, some seeds were laid in me by my family, by a missionary named Leon d'Orleans from Haiti, that I really felt called to the ministry. I mean, one of those deals I've always known what I wanted to do. You know, sometimes you think about, you know, you want to be a professional athlete, you want to be all those things. Well, first of all, God didn't leave any question that I was not going to be a professional athlete, but that really I felt like this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to preach. I wanted to be a minister of the gospel, and I didn't know exactly what that looked like. And so I followed that path and went off to Bible college and had my my undergraduate work at Kentucky Christian College, Kentucky Christian University now, and came back and got my first job in Marengo, Indiana, Marengo Christian Church. A basketball coach at the time. It's funny how they play a part in that. Jerry Hanger said, "Hey, you need to apply for our youth ministry at our church," and that's where I started. And then I did that for a little while, and then I went to a place called Gosport, Indiana, Gosport Christian Church, and I learned under a man of great wisdom, 40 to 50 years of ministry, Norman Ward, who I've known my entire life. So I got my some learning teeth there. But I always felt like preaching in a church was where God was going to lead me to be. Now, I never had a desire to be a church planter, didn't know how to do that, but it kind of goes back to I was in this ministry at Gosport, and it was a good ministry, but it was one of those deals where so many in the church wanted to be comfortable. They didn't really want to grow to the fact that they would be uncomfortable. And I wasn't wired to be one of those ministers that was just a maintenance minister that just kept things going. I've always felt like you got to get people to Jesus. You got to keep growing. You got to exist for people who are not yet members of your church. That's kind of a big deal. It's the Great Commission, and the Great Commandment all in one. So that's kind of where my heart was. Well, I started praying about where God might send me that might be a church like that. And I was thinking, you know, some doors are going to open. I'm going to go work at a church that's really missional, really wants to reach lost people, wants to just have people that are on that target mission. And not only was I not getting that nudge, I was not getting those opportunities. I wasn't seeing them. I would get on the college websites to see job openings, and nothing was jumping out. Well, as it turns out, I grew up in French Lick, as I said, just a half hour from Redemption in Jasper. And I had worked in summer at basketball camps here because my brother's a teacher in Jasper. He coached basketball for many years, coaches football still to this day. And so I'd work summer camps with the head coach, Kenny Schulteis, was here today. He paid some good money for me to come around and work with his varsity players to lead the kids camps. we'd do 3 or 4 weeks every summer. And Kenny just was always nice to me, always good to me. And he would always say, he said on more than one occasion, hey, you ought to come here and start a church. You can help run my biddy program. You can start a church. And Kenny was Catholic, so he said, I wouldn't attend the church because I'm going to go to my church, but I would support you. And he kind of planted that seed all those years before. And so when I fast forward a good 6-7 years later, I'm sitting there in Gosport praying about where God came. It just like he just kept laying on my heart, Jasper. And that was confusing to me because I'm not sure I thought that I had any capabilities to do anything like start a church. But I definitely felt it, and I asked some friends to pray about it, and some friends came back and they said, you know what? We think if that's what you're hearing, that's what you should do. And so I went to the elders of that church, and I told them the plans, and they supported me wholeheartedly to resign. I spent a month and a half or two still working there as I prepared to come back to southern Indiana and to do this. And so, I talked to my family. They were behind it. And so my mom and dad said, you know what, we'll pay for the ads in the newspaper. We'll rent a space for you to do this. Let's go look for space to do this. And we ended up landing on in May of 2000 on starting, and we ended up planning to start at the Days Inn meeting room. And Jasper, Indiana, they had these meeting rooms where, offices or where companies could rent it, or birthday parties could rent it, or whatever, little conferences. And so that's where we started. And the whole concept for me, I preached a sermon that I preached dozens of times since then from Mark chapter 2 about wrecking the roof to get people to Jesus, removing unnecessary barriers to get people to Jesus. And the whole concept of this new church was going to be really threefold. It was going to be that we were going to make this about Jesus and his mission and his gospel. Because I had seen so often churches get bogged down in traditions and procedures and policy, and it just drove me crazy. Like the policies and the traditions trump the mission so many times, and they never even realize it because it's just when you get in the habit of doing it that way, you don't think about change. And I couldn't stand that, and I could not be a pastor or a minister or a preacher in a church where that was the focus. And so we were going to start with making it about Jesus and his mission and the gospel. The second thing we were going to do is we were going to do things different in order to reach a different group of people. Because my philosophy is, if you do it like all the other churches, why does anybody want to come? They already have that. They would be going already. And Craig Cushell has a saying, he's a pastor, and he says, if you're going to reach people who aren't being reached, you got to do things that are not being done. And so right down to the musical style that we were going to do, to the casual atmosphere of our services, to the focusing pragmatically on teaching the Word of God, like sticking to the Bible and Jesus and working through that. That was all from the get-go a part of doing things different in order to reach different people. And so that was so important to us, to not be bogged down. We were going to have no set tradition, but simply focusing on the mission and on people and doing things differently. And we'll talk a lot more in a later episode about that, doing things differently, I think, what that looks like when it comes to worship music, what that looks like when it comes to using technology, what that looks like as far as building presentation and layout, what that is as far as ministries that you do and ministries that you do not do. But that was a big focus. And then the third thing that I was really set on, that I really believed, is you've got to help people realize how loved they are by God. And the only way to make that happen is to love them. And so love was going to drive what we did. We wanted them, if they were going to come to our services, we want them to experience love, because they've gotten torture all week long. Work, school, family feuds, marriage problems. They were going through it. So on Sundays, we wanted them to feel the love of God like never before. Like first impressions became such a big deal in the early days of this church, because we wanted people to feel that love when they came on our campuses. And in addition to that, we wanted to be loving people outside of our walls. A lot of churches do okay at loving people inside their walls, but they forget that really the whole purpose of the church is to love God and love people, and that means loving people outside the walls as well. And so we wanted to be externally focused. Rick Russo wrote a book called Externally Focused Church, and he asked the question, if your church was to pack up and move out of town, would anybody notice or miss it besides the people who attend there? And we wanted to make sure that the answer to that would be yes, absolutely they would. And so those three ideas permeated why we started. And so we gathered that first Sunday with me and my, who's now my wife, Holly, we just started dating. So you talk about stepping out on faith to come to this church. She came along with me, and then some people that we had met along the way. So there was about 12 of us, local people that said we're going to be a part of this, committed this, and that's how we started. And that was our beginnings, all with the seeds of Kenny Schulte saying, once you start a church here, and then God using that later to bring him back and to start a different type of church. We didn't need another church. We needed a different type of church.
I love that. And in particular, you talked about seeds, and there are multiple seeds that you just discussed when it comes to the origin leading to the redemption story in those aspects, but you having the intentionality, and it sounds as if, to your response to my initial question, there was never doubt in your mind what you were going to do.
No.
What was perhaps the biggest challenge to ensuring those seeds were nurtured? Was it patience and pacing as the church has grown over time and meeting your original goals?
Yeah, there was a lot of patience that needed to be involved because it was not going to grow fast. We spent really from 2000 to 2003 with very minimal growth. I mean, if you plant a church today and in 2 years it's not grown, the planters will say it's a failure, or maybe you should pull the plug, or and we didn't have much growth in the early days of the church. I mean, we were 30, 40 people by that time, and it wasn't till probably May of 2003 that, like, boom, you start seeing this real growth. So patience, but I think the biggest obstacle probably was teaching that DNA of who we were going to be. Because people come in with their expectations of what church is. And it really wasn't so much the internal people as it was the external people. We would have people calling us and say, hey, we want to sell you these pews for really, really cheap. Well, I knew we didn't want to have pews. We wanted chairs. We were not going to be a church that had pews. It was not going to be that traditional model. It's probably going to be a multi-site room. I didn't even think we'd probably ever build a permanent worship center. It would be more multi-purpose like we started with. And so they couldn't understand, hey, we're giving you this great deal. Why don't you want it? Or they'd say, hey, we want to give you these hymn books. And I knew that the direction of the church, which hadn't hit rural America much at that point, but in some of the other areas, was like, no. The worship is going to be changing all the time. There's going to be more visual. You're going to use screens. And so thank you, but no, we don't need those hymnals. And a lot of times we would just accept them, because they didn't understand why, they're trying to be gracious, and they didn't understand why we wouldn't use them. And so things like that, like helping people see this is going to be totally different. When you have, you know how it is, you have these expectations of what it is, and we had a total different desire for what it was going to be. And so you had to separate expectations from the desire, the calling that God had given us. So that was a big obstacle in the early days that I think we had to work through. The other obstacle was just, quite frankly, getting it to stick, because people come and they come with these expectations. And so the back door, it was easy to have a front door open. The back door was hard to close. And so you would have people come visit and, well, this is pretty rough. I'm not coming back. Or you would have people that wanted to be a big fish in a small pond, and when they realized they weren't going to be able to control it and build it what they wanted, then they would move on. And so you really had a lot of people come and go in the early days, so it was difficult to form the type of leaders that you wanted. And quite honestly, I didn't know what I was doing half the time, and so that was a little bit of an obstacle. And it wasn't until I started praying about God, send me people to help me do these things, that I really think we started to see that change. It's like, well, I had this big vision for the worship, that it would be modern worship, doing some old songs, some old hymns, but in new ways that are just bring, and that's, we get that now because that's what we get every week. But back then that was not done in a lot of places. And so I could visualize what needed to be done, but I had no music capabilities to make that happen myself. And so it took praying for those people. And so we had some ladies in the early days that really helped me with that. And then I was praying. I knew we wanted the praise band approach, and I was praying for a guitar player. And we had already moved from the Days Inn, the movie theater. Now we're over in Kathy Lane where we bought this warehouse, and I'm still praying for that guitar player. And that's when Daniel Ross showed up, who ended up really transforming our worship ministry and is now our executive pastor and still leads worship and the bands here today. But like I literally was praying for somebody, and I mentioned in the sermon, and he grabbed me and he said, I play a little guitar. Now, little did he know where that was going to lead, And the fact, if when we get into people's stories, the fact that he was in Jasper was only a God thing to start with. Like, he had no reason to be here other than God put him here and kept him here. And so you start seeing those kind of things unfold. But those were some of the obstacles we faced in the early days.
Another piece is I'm listening to you and I'm correlating. I just love the fact you knew your path almost from the get-go. You got the support from mom and dad, and I'm nearing 64, and I relate to the YouTube song, and I still haven't found what I'm looking for, even today in that piece. But the story you're saying from the origin, how it aligns so much to Jesus's development with the disciples. And in particular, you've talked to me a lot as we prepared to put together the redemption story in the episodes about how you and your team have never wanted redemption to become a church that is built on formalities.
Right.
And to me, that says you want to meet every single member. And I think recently you told me the church exceeded 2,000 when you bring all of its membership in or attendees from all the sites. But yet you work so hard to meet every individual where they are, as they are at that moment.
Yeah, so that third core value of loving people where you are, to me, the driver, the best vehicle for that is relationship. And you hear us talk a lot about relationship here. Like, we are a relational church. Like, people say, you can't learn every name when you have over 2,000 people. And that's absolutely true, you can't. But I believe that should not be a deterrent to me learning as many names as I possibly can. Because in relationship, you know people's names. And there's power in knowing people's names. I often use that illustration. If I'm walking down the middle of a crowded mall, people could say all kinds of things and I don't hear it, but I will hear them say, "Hey, Daryl," when somebody sees me and yells at me. Because why is it? Because there's power in your name. There's something in your brain that kicks off when you hear that. And so there's power in relationship. There's power in names. And so we knew we wanted to be very relational driven. And that's impossible to do well if you don't have a couple things. One is we believe in our small groups. We want more people to be in our small groups, but that's a different story for a different day. But also, you'll notice on our campuses that you go there that each one of them has a large gathering space, a lobby, an atrium. And I told our architect at the Jasper campus when we were designing, it's like, I want you to picture an airport terminal, because people come and go and they gather. They do both of those things, and our lobby space needs to be that, because a big part of our DNA is that buzz you get on Sunday mornings when you're in there and you're seeing people. They're drinking their coffee, they're talking, they're sharing, they're talking about the ball game that night, they're talking about church and the sermon that day, they're talking about family and catching up, and that chance to just really be relational. And I've brought people in from all over the country, and they catch that in our lobby. They'll tell me, that's part of the ingredient right there. And so it's non-negotiable. We're starting a campus, we're opening a place. It's got to have some version of that. They can't all be as big as what maybe Jasper and Lagode's atrium lobby area is, but they have to have some version of that, because that's a big part of who we are. It's that relationship driven thing, because every person counts. And Jesus told the parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, because every last one matters. And then he talks about that prodigal son and how it mattered. And so I think how he mattered. And so I think that's the gist of who God, like the shepherd left the 99 to get the one. The 99 was together and safe, but he was going after that one. And so we want everyone to count, and you can't do that without relational living and a relational focus. And so that's a big part of it.
Well, as we get into future episodes, Daryl, we'd like to talk more about the seeds that have been planted from origin and how do they stay fresh and grow from there. You certainly hit upon the people and the music, but one of the things that I've wrapped my arms around as God has allowed me to look back through my life and remove the fog and understand why things work so well when maybe they shouldn't, and why maybe they didn't work so well when they should have, when I got in the way of that piece. But when I enter this church on a Sunday, and I think anyone who would come in, whether it's at your Tell City, your Lagodi, your Jasper campuses, or through the streaming episodes, or through other outreach programs, there seems like the church is giving us a fresh seed to start for that day. And I correlate that very much from your messages, from LG's messages, and the consistent mission around the aspect of, we need to be self-aware in all aspects of our life. And if we get too proud that we're not understanding where we're self-aware at, is when we slow down that growth with God, with living as Jesus would want us to live in that peace. Just briefly, lead us into the future a bit as we'll hit upon this a bit more. What keeps this seed fresh, living like Jesus and bringing the redemption story every week, every day for you and your staff?
Well, so gospel focus is a big deal. Like too many churches in the 80s and 90s, where there's a lot of preaching on how to have a good marriage, and we teach those things. I think the Bible's full of good wisdom on how to live life in so many ways. But your focus must be, the power doesn't come in that. The power comes in the gospel. It comes in Jesus. And so that's number one, is you've got to constantly keep that. The second thing I would say is you've got to have the right culture and DNA all the time. A coach comes into a new system, and they hire a new coach. Some coaches right off the bat have success. Some it takes time, some never do. What's the difference? Well, there's a culture that they're bringing, and when there's buy-in to that culture, then everything changes. And so there's a saying that I've heard said many times, people want to do strategy, and I have no trouble with strategizing. We sit around and do some of that. But the saying is, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. In other words, you can have all the perfect strategy, but if you don't have the right culture, that gospel people-focused culture is what I would call ours. If you don't have that, if you don't guard that, if you don't live in that, strategy will never work. And so that's the key for us to keep that, and that's where we go in the future. Like, that part does not change. Our methods change, but that will not change. And that's, to me, the key.
What is really awesome as we wrap up this episode, just the passion. I sense this would be the Daryl I would speak to 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, as this dream and seed was first being watered, if you will, or nurtured. Mm-hmm. So God bless you, brother, for your time again, and look forward to the future as we continue these discussions.
It'll be fun.
Appreciate you, man.
Thanks, Kevin.